In December 2023, I became the proud owner of a very derelict 2-foot gauge Davenport steam locomotive. In this series, I'm going to document its restoration back to operation. I hope you'll join me. Small locomotives such as mine were often referred to as dinkies because of their small size. They were designed to be transported to and from the job site as a contractor needed. Dinky locomotives generally operated on either 2-foot or 3-foot gauge track. The heaviest dinky weighed around 18 tons, while the lightest was about 5 tons. Normally, most dinkies that you'd see in operation weighed between 7 and 9 tons. Dinky locomotives were a common sight throughout North America prior to the adoption of dump trucks. They filled essentially the same role, moving materials from one place to another. Most construction contractors would use a pair of dinkies with a steam shovel. One dinky would be dumping its cars as the shovel was loading the other dinky's train. These powerful little engines were expected to work at full capacity for weeks or even months at a time with little to no maintenance. And dinkies were generally operated by a single man who would fill the role as locomotive engineer, fireman, and sometimes even mechanic all at the same time. In 1915, the largest railroad construction contractor in North America was Foley, Welsh and Stewart, or as the employees called it, freeze 'em, whip 'em, and starve 'em. Foley was also one of the largest single buyers of dinky locomotives, placing the largest order Davenport ever received at one time for 24 identical little 9-ton 040s. My engine was purchased new by Foley, Welsh and Stewart in 1912. Between the poorly maintained track, inexperienced operators, and general lack of concern for any kind of safety, accidents were a common occurrence. The dinky that didn't suffer an accident or two was the one that never left the manufacturer's showroom. Locomotive manufacturers such as Davenport, H.K. Porter, and Vulcan knew the kind of treatment their products would receive at the hand of the contractor, so they designed these little engines to be tough and resilient, capable of rolling off the track one day and being back to work the next. No matter how well these engines were designed and built, the vast majority of them were out of work by the Great Depression. Dump trucks and gas shovels had taken their place on the job site. World War II and its scrap drives were the final nail in their coffin. Their numbers declined from many hundred to only a handful which exist today. Now that you know a little bit about dinky locomotives, let's get back to the story of my engine. After months of planning, myself and a couple friends made the 1,200-mile drive to pick it up. The plan was simple: drive there, load it with a hired crane, and drive home. What could go wrong, right? As soon as we arrived, I could see my forlorn little engine sitting in the field, just waiting to be restored to its former glory. Until this moment, I hadn't actually seen the engine in person, but I knew from the photos the owner had sent me, it was rough. Sometime after 1915, it ended up working at a mine in Alaska. Later, it went to another mine, where it ran as a steam engine until the early 1950s. At that point, they decided to convert it to gas power by removing the boiler, using sledgehammers of course, and installing a gasoline engine. Apparently, it wasn't very successful because it was out of service shortly thereafter. As much as I wanted to keep looking the engine over, we were on a tight schedule, so a detailed assessment would have to wait until later. The first thing we had to do was locate all the loose parts and get them loaded into the pickup truck. I was pleasantly surprised to find that most of the parts taken off the locomotive during the conversion were still with it. There's very few that need to be replicated. After loading all the parts, it was back to the engine. We positioned the trailer next to it in preparation for loading, and I used ratchet straps to secure the tank and boiler to the frame, so they didn't move during transit. The tank and boiler are actually just sitting there. They're not rigidly attached due to the previously mentioned gasoline conversion. Now that we were fully prepared for the crane to arrive, I had some time to look the engine over in a little bit more detail. The most obvious thing is it needs a new boiler, which isn't a big problem because I already have a spare Davenport steam locomotive boiler that came off of one of its sisters. Besides that, the prognosis is the engine's junk. Everything's either broken, worn out, seized, or questionable. Bottom line, this thing is in terrible condition. Unbeknownst to me, as I was happily looking at my new acquisition, the crane I hired, the only crane for 50 miles, was suffering a mechanical issue. It turns out they wouldn't be able to load the locomotive after all. With no other options, and only having two 5-ton jacks, a 1.5-ton come-along, and a pile of solid railroad ties, it was decided we'd just load it ourselves. Working late into the night, we managed to get it jacked up a foot off the ground. With this, we knew that our plan was going to work, so we called it an evening, went back to the hotel, and got a good night's sleep. Bright and early the next morning, we went back to work. Our plan was to jack the locomotive up high enough that we could winch it, along with the skid, the two pieces of rail welded together that it's sitting on, right onto the trailer and secure it in place. This necessitated jacking it slowly, inches at a time, and blocking it as we did so, always ensuring that there was 4-point contact and that the locomotive was never more than an inch higher than the next contact point below it. That way, should anything happen, it wouldn't drop very far. Safety was the number one priority. As exciting as it looks sped up, I can tell you this was a very slow and mundane process. It took hours of jacking and blocking and jacking and blocking to get the engine to a point where we could back the trailer under the front foot or foot and a half of the rails. Now that the locomotive was high enough, and the trailer was properly positioned underneath the front of the rail skid, we blocked the rear end of the trailer so it wouldn't sink once weight was distributed to it. We then jacked up the rear end of the locomotive, placing the weight of the front of the locomotive on the trailer. We started removing the timber frame from the middle of the locomotive and replaced it with a new timber frame that was in line with the rail and the trailer. It rested against the back of the trailer. On top of that, we placed tie plates, which the skid that the locomotive is sitting on would then sit on. This gave us a metal-on-metal contact surface, which would make winching the whole assembly into the trailer much easier. Now, with the timbers that the locomotive is sitting on resting against the back of the trailer, as we winch the locomotive forward, none of the timber frame can move. That creates a very safe situation. Now, the timbers at the very back of the locomotive, they were expected to collapse as we winched it onto the trailer. That was just part of the plan all along. As it sits, the engine weighs about 11,200 pounds. So in order for our little 1.5 ton come-along to pull it onto the trailer, we had to jack the skid up and place pieces of round stock underneath to act as rollers. Without these makeshift rollers, that little come-along never could have dragged the engine onto the trailer as it did. After a couple hours, we were all loaded. All that was left to do was to clean up the work site, put all the timbers back where we found them, put the rollers back where we found them, and just make sure that the engine was perfectly positioned on the trailer before we tied it down. At that point, chain it down and get ready for its long ride home. After nearly 50 years of sitting in the desert, the Davenport was on its way to a new home and a new existence. Its restoration won't be quick, and it certainly won't be easy, but it's going to be done right. And hopefully, it'll inspire somebody else to take on an utterly insane project. I hope you've enjoyed this first video. There's going to be many more of them to come. So please consider becoming a subscriber, and if you can, hit the bell icon so you don't miss out on any upcoming content. Once again, I really appreciate you watching, and we'll see you next time.